Well, welcome everyone to session 3. We're talking about ministry, healing, and evangelism in small groups. And we're talking about how to bring groups to the church, but also how to utilize those group settings to best minister to the people that we come into contact with. Last week in session 1 and 2, we talked about how getting those groups started, it's important to identify what kind of group you're in, what kind of group you're wanting to get started. One thing I have definitely found is that if you don't identify the group will identify you, and which could be fine sometimes, but it's also something that can end up bringing you further and further away from the vision that you feel like God had for you in that group setting. So when we talk about defining the groups, I did a class some time ago that's available online with Jacksonville Theological Seminary, and it was mission, vision, and values. And the whole point of that is to kind of define what it is that you feel like God's speaking to your heart. So if you're listening to this class, either as a pastor or as a lay minister and looking to see how groups fits into that, the first thing I would encourage you to do is I would encourage you to figure out what it is that God's speaking to you. You know, how is it that God wants to meet you, through you, meet needs of people around you? Definition that I used for ministry last week, we talked about seeing a need and meeting it. You know, the three questions that are asked in defining what a mission statement is who is it that I feel like God's called me to minister to? What are their needs, and how will I meet those needs? That's basically what a mission statement is. And so you really need to have an idea of what your mission is when you set out to form any type of group. Now, several years ago, I had the opportunity to come alongside of a pastor in a church, and he came to me and said, "Pastor John, what I'd like for you to do is I'd like for you to get groups really up and going in this congregation." And so I said, "Well, what do you have going right now?" He says, "Well, we have some groups going." He says, "But, you know, some of them have been going for a long time. Some have kind of started falling away." And I said, "Well, how do you define that? How do you define success in a group? What exactly are you looking to do? Are you looking to start some type of life group? Are you looking to start cell groups? Are you looking to start ministry groups? What exactly are you trying to accomplish?" And his answer was yes. I want to accomplish all that, you know. And that leads me to a place where when we're talking about groups, I want you to think about this as we look at this over the course of the next 5 weeks. I want you to look at this from two different perspectives, and I'm going to try to paint a picture from two different perspectives. One is the perspective of a lead pastor who is wanting to get groups started within their congregation. The other direction that I want you to be able to see this from is from a person who is coming alongside of a pastor and just wanting to get a group started. So there'll be facilitating large group, a large amount of groups, and there'll be facilitating a group. So when we talk about types of groups, here in session 3, we're going to kind of focus on the different types of groups, and we're going to take that also into session 4 tonight. So if you were to, first of all, define a small group, there's different philosophies on that, but really, typically, you're talking about between 5 and 15 people in a small group. And, questions that I have different times is, well, is it okay if our group becomes 20 or 25? Or is it okay if our group stays at around 4 or 5 people? Well, the problem is that it goes back to mission. What is it that you're trying to accomplish? Because typically in a small group, the benefit to having a small group is that it enables an intimacy, a level of intimacy that they can't get in a larger setting. So if you start getting to 20, 25 people, sometimes you start losing the very identity that you were hoping to accomplish, and that is to be able to have some time where somebody feels comfortable to kind of share what they're going through. So the first type of groups that we're going to talk about tonight is we're going to talk about what I define as life groups. One thing you will find is that if you start doing any type of search or research on your own about small groups, or if you've been through different studies before, you will find that the names that people call groups can vary a great deal. And for a lot of people, they consider groups all the same. What they may call it life groups, or they may call it small groups, or they may call it home groups or church groups or cell groups, and it all classifies as anything that you call it. But what I have found in my experience is I have found that the groups are different. And so that's what I hope to kind of break out tonight. So the first thing is life groups. And life groups is typically finding a group of people that share something in common. From the very definition of a life group, what you're hoping to do is you're hoping to have people encounter these accountability groups that will help them through their station of life. One of the most basic needs of every human being is a need to be connected and a need to be accepted. And where the church really struggles in this is you can have an environment that feels very welcoming. You can have, a host and hostess at the door, and they can greet every person. The pastor can physically shake the hand of every person that was there that day. He can be very engaging, very loving. But I'll tell you where the rubber meets the road, and where the rubber meets the road is 60 seconds after the pastor says, "You may go in peace." Because then what happens is you find groups of people that will congregate. You'll find groups of people that are headed out to maybe go get a bite to eat together, and you will have people who never feel more alone than they do at 5 minutes after a service is over. Because they realize that although they were a part of a group, they're really not a part. There's that disconnectedness. And so what you hope to accomplish in small groups is, at the very basic level, is you're hoping to accomplish getting people connected to other people that have similar positions in life. And by similar positions, let me give you some examples of some life groups. One example of a life group is a men's group. Well, it's very easy to see that something that group has in common is that they're all men. And so typically, men are going through similar issues. They're having similar struggles. They're at similar places in life. You may have, a man who, like myself, I was talking with a few people in the class before this, got 3 teenagers, I work full-time as an administrator, and, I have a wife of 20 plus years, and, those all create certain responsibilities that I have. I have a responsibility to be a husband. I have a responsibility to be a father. I have a responsibility to be a good employer. But also I'm very connected to the church, and I'm a pastor on staff at the church. So I have a responsibility to the church, and all of those plates are just kind of spinning there. And it's great to have a group that of men that are all going through that similar thing. Every man, has somebody that is possibly depending on them. Every man is either, in a job or trying to find a job. Every man knows what it feels like to be in a place where you've lost a job or where you don't feel like you can make any more advancement in the job. And quite honestly, some of you know my testimony, my history, and I was a vocational pastor for many years, meaning that the only income I derived was derived from pastoring a church. And one of the things that I always struggled with, and something that I knew that God was preparing me for, is the fact that I'd be at the church office, it would be 10 o'clock in the morning, and most of the people that I hoped to impact were at work, and so as a pastor, you study, you maybe make some home visits, some hospital visits for people who aren't at work that day or people who are in long-term care. Maybe you host a couple of things there at the church for other leaders in the community. But in the end, you realize that the bulk of your ministry is really going to happen after people punch the clock in the evening and on the weekend. And so for small group leaders, it's easy for me to understand if I come to you as another man in the men's group and say, hey man, I missed you last week, and you go, yeah, my kid had a baseball game, and man, it's been a crazy week. I know exactly what you're talking about, And what I can say is, hey, well, what time do you head out in the morning? Maybe we can grab a biscuit together one morning and just pray together, or is there anything I can help you out with? And we can identify with each other's issues because of the fact that we're both walking through it. I mean, in fact, here in this class tonight, we got men that have been working all day, and you're here and you're sitting in this class, and, it's late, you might have somebody at home that needs something, and you're giving of your time, but this is a sacrifice that you're willing, that you see that needs to be made. Well, it's easy to get that if you're walking in it, because, I haven't been at home sleeping all day. I've been out there in the streets. I've been working today. And so now to come here, we share something in common. We've all been punching that clock today. We've all worked. We all have stuff going on at home. We all have, maybe a busy plate for tomorrow. But here we find ourselves in community tonight because we all share something in common. And that's a desire to find out more about home groups and life groups and how they can impact the church and how they can impact our lives. So men's group is a group that can do that. Another group is women's groups. And, it seems to me that over the last 25, 30 years, that in the development of small groups and life groups, it really appears to me that you kind of have churches that either they do small groups, or if they don't do small groups, they'll still have like a men's group, they'll have a women's group, they'll have something that people who have something similar in common can connect on. And, God in His infinite wisdom didn't make men and women the same, and there's things that if as a man I'm looking for work, I've found myself out of work, my wife can say, I know this is tough for you, but she doesn't know it from the place of a provider, like another man would know. Well, the same thing is true with my wife, that if she is struggling with a child leaving home, I can't feel it the same way that a mother does that has invested all of her time into a child's life to see that child then grow up and to leave home. I can feel it from a perspective of a dad, But I'll never know what that perspective as a mom feels like. But you get into a women's group and you have the opportunity to connect with other women who maybe they've already passed that stage in their life, and they have an opportunity to say, this is a great opportunity for you to pour into God, or this is a great opportunity for you to sit back and see the fruit of all that labor, and to be able to speak into another woman. And the greatest thing about the men's group and the women's group is it satisfies, the biblical principle that the older men will speak wisdom and direction into the younger men, and the older women will speak direction and they will mentor the younger women. And that gives an opportunity for that to live out in real time, in real issues that people are having. Another type of a group, of a life group, would be singles. I mentioned earlier that I've been married for 20 plus years, and I don't know what it's like to be a single guy today, but I know that I have friends that have gone through divorce. They've gone through losing their spouse to death, and finding that place where they reconnect is a very difficult thing. And also for people who they still have not found the person that God has in store for them, it's a great opportunity for people who have similar positions in life to be able to, edify and build up one another. Other ideas of life groups are young marrieds. The people who are young married groups, the issues that they're facing are not the same issues that I'm facing after being married 20 years. The issues that they're facing is, how are they going to get their life moving in the direction of the two of them being together. Parents with young kids are, going through similar things in life. Homeschooling groups, parents with kids in sports, seniors, hobby groups. And the reason why I mention all these groups is because the one thing that runs as a common thread through all of these groups is that it gives an opportunity for people to not only have something in common that they can share with each other, but it also gives people an opportunity to make friendships and to make relationships with people that hopefully will be a godly influence into their lives. I know that, one of the most difficult groups in the church, and has been probably since the beginning of church, is that group that they're trapped in between being a kid and being an adult. That 19 to 25, they don't really fit in with the kids anymore, but yet they don't necessarily see their place with the adults. And so a lot of churches try to address that with a young adults group or college and careers group. And those are great groups because it gives them an opportunity to not fall away from the church, because in that time they're trying to find their own path for how they will navigate their faith and their life. So life groups are any type of group where the whole purpose of the group is to be able to actually have life with those groups. And so the format typically with life groups is that the leader of a life group is more of a facilitator than anything else. And they're facilitating when are the groups going to meet, what day best works, when are we going to get together, what time, how is that going to look. The maturity level of a life group leader needs to be medium to high. And the reason why I say the maturity level of a life group leader needs to be medium or high is because sometimes you're going to be encountering people that are going to talk about certain issues, and you need the maturation level to be able to deal with those issues and to not let those issues become broadcasted on the street. Spiritual maturity, depending on the type of group it is, the spiritual maturity doesn't necessarily have to be that high. I mean, this is one of those things. Let me give you an example of a group that meets, and I have a friend that is a part of that group, and they all really get into to bicycling, and so they spend the money on those bikes that I would spend on my first car, and they have the helmets and they have the suits, and they get out there on the open road and they'll ride 40, 50, 60 miles on those bikes. And there'll be a group, he's a part of a group of people that they get together, they'll spend some time in prayer, they'll do a devotional, and then they'll go on a bike ride, And so the truth is that the leader of that group doesn't have to really have a real high spiritual maturation level. They need to be a mature emotionally, so that they can deal with some issues that may come up, but they're not necessarily breaking ground theologically. They're just trying to create a group that people can find Christian fellowship, and that they can get prayer for stuff that they're going through, and that they can kind of keep towards a devotional type led life. So facilitate the wins and the wheres, make sure communication is high, and that life events are being celebrated. If you're going to have a group that's classified as a life group, if you are a leader and you're going to do a men's group, or you're going to do a group for young adults or something like that, you really need to make sure that you are that you're celebrating those life moments, because that's what that group is about. It's about recognizing birthdays and anniversaries, and recognizing somebody graduating from college, or somebody having a kid born, or whatever the case may be, is to celebrate those moments in life, because hopefully you develop a group of people that years down the road they still have a very strong connection with. So birthdays, anniversaries, promotions, baptisms, birth of children, anything like that. You also tackle head first life issues that come up, such as death of a spouse, sorry, I'm getting a little feedback. Death of a child, or death of a spouse, or losing a job, all the different things that can really tackle somebody in the midst of life and kind of make them sidelined. So you want to make sure that you're celebrating the moments, but that you're also very attentive to the challenges that everyday life would bring to people. For a life group, I want to give you some ideas about some rules that you would want to have in place for a life group. And the number one rule of a life group, and this can be very difficult, is don't let your group become a clique. Don't let it become a closed group of people that nobody else can ever break into. Because if that's the case, then you're actually sending the exact opposite message of a small group. And what you're saying is that you are not accepted, when the whole idea of groups is for everybody to find a place of acceptance. Don't share news that is not yours, If somebody at the group shares that they just found out their wife is pregnant, that's their news to share, you know. Don't go put it on Facebook as soon as the meeting's over. And their parents find out by Facebook instead of by the happy couple. It's really important with life groups is to keep life groups Christ-centered. That can be challenging sometimes if it's a typical type of life group. Like, for example, you can have a men's group, and if you don't have a strong facilitator keeping that meeting, Christ-based, it could become, an hour that we spend every week to talk about the football games from Sunday. It could become an hour that we talk about how the wife is driving me crazy, or how work is going, or it could be a time for me to tout all my accomplishments at work that week. And you need to, the facilitator in a life group needs to make sure that they're keeping that type of group Christ-based and Christ-centered. And the best way to do that is to make sure that every time the group gets together, that you have some very key things that are set in place. For example, that every time we get together, we will have a time of prayer. Every time we get together, we will have some type of devotional, whether it's reading the scripture and everybody's sharing, kind of what they hear through that scripture, or whether it's going through a more structured devotional, something that you can find in any Christian bookstore, but that there's something that says the reason that we are together is because the most important thing that we have in common that we're all men, or we have in common that we're all seniors, or we have in common that we're all singles, but the most important thing that we have in common is that we all love Jesus and that we're all a part of his family. So, and the last rule that I have listed here is that no one gets left behind. That's really critical for any type of life group. Let me give you an example of how that happens. You have a men's group, and the men's group gets together, and they get together on Monday night, and they have a devotional, they have a time of prayer, they have a time of sharing kind of what's going on in their life, time of ministry, and then the group ends, and 7 of the guys go off to the wing house to have wings, and one guy gets left behind, didn't know anything about it. So my recommendation is, I list this as a recommendation instead of a rule, is I recommend that if anybody's going, having any type of event, if you're inviting anybody from the group, you invite everyone from the group, and that way nobody feels that they're being left out of the group. Another type of groups that you can have, and there's, once again, like I said, there's a lot of different names for these different types of groups, but I'm going to give you my names for the purpose of this class, and what I call support groups. And we're going to be going into detail about this later on, how ministry and healing and evangelism happens in all these different types of groups. And we're going to have somebody come and share of a personal experience of walking through a support group. But one type of a support group is a survivors group. I'm telling you that as a pastor, I have sat with people who have survived kinds of things, but because I myself have not walked through some type of traumatic survival thing, I can never fully understand some of that stress and some of that trauma that they experience. I mean, it's very understandable that when the horrific events of 9/11 took place, that one thing that was an epidemic in the fire department, and this is a very tough thing, but that a lot of the men who survived, the men firefighters who survived, somehow over a short period of time became connected with the wives of the men who lost their spouses in the 9/11 tragedy, and a lot of them ended up leaving current spouses and trying to find a new life with these spouses who had lost husbands in the tragedy. And at first glance, you look at that and you say, oh, that is horrible, which it is. But one thing that they shared in common is they understood the loss of somebody that they deeply loved, and so that automatically gave them a connection. And they didn't know how to identify, to define it, and so it ended up causing them to move into a very hurtful situation. But it's something that you see that if you haven't walked through it, you don't know exactly where somebody's at. You know, another group that I would put beside it of survivors is not somebody who personally survived some type of illness or incident or tragedy, but somebody who survived the loss of somebody who, through natural causes or through tragedy or through some other type of life event, they found themselves left trying to pick up the pieces. And so, you know, somebody would classify that as, oh, that's like a grief support class, but it goes so much more than that, because, I mean, one thing you realize is that if somebody's been married for 20 plus years, I mean, as a husband, you always want to try to be a helpmate to your wife, and as a wife, you always want to try to be a helpmate to your husband. But over a period of time, your roles kind of become identified, and then all of a sudden you lose that role in your life. And you know, I've sat with many women who couldn't tell you how much they had in their checking account, couldn't tell you where they would find the most recent bills that need to be paid. And it wasn't that my husband kept it from him, it's that he just always took care of it, you know, or vice versa. The wife always took care of it, and the husband just didn't worry about it. The husband came home and said, honey, here's my paycheck, and she made sure that the lights stayed on, she made sure that the kids had food, and now all of a sudden he doesn't have a clue where to go from there. You know, and so it's not just dealing with the grief of loss, it's dealing with the redefining of their roles in life, you know. And everybody has had experiences with loved ones who have lost, or you yourself have lost. And I have people who 8-10 years later still not dealing with it good, you know. And so these types of groups are invaluable for people who are walking through that, because it gives them connection to other people who are in similar places in life. Now, you have survivors, you have you know, groups that of people who have battled addictions. You have groups of people who share in common that they have a special needs child in their lives. And then there can be groups that are not as life-changing in that, but as, you know, places that they find themselves in their life where people who are in debt, you know, and they don't know how to get out of debt, and they just kind of have this addiction to to always living above their means or never being able to manage their money. And you also have Bible studies, and you have book groups, and you can have dinner groups. There's a lot of different types of groups. And remember, what you're trying to do is you're trying to find a homogeneous group. You're trying to find a group that shares something in common. There are churches that do geographical groups, and geographical groups can be very successful in meeting the needs of people. The most well-known person who has done geographical groups at one time, I don't know, I haven't read anything recently, but at one time it was the largest church in the world, and that was Dr. Young-E Cho's church in Korea. And once upon a time he had 120,000 members as a part of his church. And in order to facilitate that size group of people, basically not everybody could come to church every week. That basically they came at a particular Sunday of the month. You know, I go the first Sunday of the month. This person goes the second Sunday of the month. They would have multiple services throughout the week, but they still could not accommodate that many people. And so really the way they accommodate it is they accommodate it through much smaller groups. They accommodate it through groups of 50 or groups of 100. And people who are a part of those types of groups, the best way for that church to meet that need was to do it geographically. You know, hey, we're all a part of the same church. We recognize that everybody can't be here at the same time. There's not room for that. So there's a group that meets here, 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 and here. You just go to whichever one is closest to you, and it'll be a representation of the church as a whole, you know. And geographical groups can be successful, but what I have found is that in order for them to be successful, you have to have a very purposeful group that every group has to look the same. And the reason why is because this person will be attending this group and here, oh, that group over there, they have cake when they're done, you know, and pretty soon they're going over here. Or, oh, that group over there where Sister Susie goes, you know, she makes her gumbo every week, and I'm going to go over there because it's good food, you know, and my group doesn't do food. And so if you're going to do geographical groups, then you have to make them all the same so that no matter where the person goes, they're not feeling like they're missing out on something at a different location. So that's with geographical groups. There are some things that you have to really navigate when you're doing groups. And one of those is you have to navigate what you're going to do with kids if it applies. You know, if you have a singles group, you're probably not dealing with that as much, although you'll have some single parents that may want to be a part of that group. But for the most part, if you're dealing with, you know, some type of life group where people meet on a regular basis, you know, are you going to have a place for kids to be able to meet? Do they meet there on location where the group is meeting, or is there an off-site place that everybody's dropping the kids off? If there is, what's the protocol there? You know, how are you making sure that the kids are going to be safe and that the person watching the kids can reach out to the adults? A lot of groups just try to incorporate the whole family, you know. Let's just get them all in here together, you know, between, you know, 5 and 50, and we're going to share a little worship together. We're going to share a little word together and a little prayer, and you know, it's not that long. The kids can just be a part of it and contribute where the Lord leads the kids to contribute. So that is one question, though. If you're talking about starting groups as a senior pastor, you need to ask yourself, well, am I going to require the groups to answer that question for kids, or is it going to be something where you just say no kids, and each person, if you have kids, you just have to find your own solution for your kids, but how are you going to deal with that? Second thing is, for groups, is you really want to have a good start-stop time, because typically they're being done where people have work the next day, or they have class, or they have something going on the next day. If they're coming in because you said the group starts at 7 and nobody's really starting until like 7:25, if it's supposed to get over at 8 and last night it went till 9:30, what you're going to do is you're going to cause a group to either become very dysfunctional, or it's going to be a group that nobody wants to be a part of. You have to really have some type of training for the host, because if you were hosting one of these groups at your home, it can be very overwhelming to the host. You know, somebody brings coffee in, spills it on the carpet, kids running around the house, something gets broken. You know, old Charlie, he won't seem to leave when the group's over, and my wife's ready to go to bed, and I'm trying to kick Charlie out and don't want to be mean to him, you know. So you really need to, the host of groups really need to have some type of training that says, this is when it starts, this is when it stops, and this is how you end it. You say, okay, appreciate everybody coming, let's walk out, you know. If you're having a different type of event where this isn't this is not a group session, this is us just getting together to celebrate, you know, the holidays together, then, you know, obviously the rules are much more relaxed. A lot of people recommend that that you try to rotate between hosts, you know, so that no one person is sharing the load of, you know, the neighbors yelling at them because everybody's parking in front of their driveway, that type of thing. And you have to figure out how you're going to handle parking issues within the group. This is the end of session 3. We're going to come back for session 4, and we're going to cover some more types of churches, and we're going to get into a type of group called cell groups. So